So I'm recording my homily for the 20th Sunday in Ordinary Time. And if you remember the readings when you were attending Mass, we had a reading about Jeremiah. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Jeremiah. So Jeremiah is one of the major prophets, and he's just a phenomenal person. He's so close to God. He's that person that you would probably want to turn to get advice. But then he would give the advice so purely and so challengingly and so lovingly that you might not want to hear it because it's so perfect. You know, oftentimes in our spiritual lives, we want to grow little by little. It's a little easier to do that rather than all at once. Jeremiah is the type of person to just give it all at once, and we'll see that in the story today. And then the gospel, I'm going to read a little bit from the gospel today because I want us to hear Jesus' words. I want us to hear not just his emotion, but his sentiment, his feeling that's coming out in the gospel. So this is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12, and we're starting at verse 49, and I'll just read a little bit of it. So Jesus said to his disciples, "I have come to set the earth on fire, and how I wish it were already blazing. There is a baptism with which I must be baptized, and how great is my anguish until it is accomplished. Do you think I have come to establish peace on earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, a household of 5 will be divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. And a father will be divided against his son, and a son against his father." And it goes on, and it doesn't get any more cheerier. And so if you're hearing this and you're thinking to yourself, because think about it. Let's say one day somebody comes up to you, and let's say they're not Catholic, and so they say, "Okay, so you're Catholic. Tell me what it is about the Catholic faith that makes you get up Sunday morning and want to go to church, right? What makes you want to be Catholic, especially given our world today and how we're as Catholics, we're kind of countercultural if we really follow what we believe." And so this person, let's say, sincerely wants to know, what is it about the Catholic faith? And so let's say you give them an answer, and at some point you're probably going to say something like, "You know, deep down, when I know I'm doing God's will, I have a sense of peace. When I know my family is living the way Jesus Christ wants us to live in accordance with the gospel, but not just that we're following his teachings, but that we're in union with God, that we're really close to him. That there's a sense of love there and a peace there that's just so much higher than anything the world can give." Now, good answer. Does that sound like anything that Jesus says today in the gospel? No, it's this passion that he has. And at first, I think it scares us. It's like, whoa, this is language we're not accustomed to with Jesus. How I wish the world were ablaze. How we wish earth was ablaze. What does he mean by that, right? "I've come to bring division, not peace." Well, everything I just said was about how we desire peace. So what is Jesus getting at? Now, there's a couple possibilities. One, he's just having a bad day. Let's say he's just angry, okay? Doesn't sound like Jesus, though. And why would they put that in the gospel? There's something deeper going on here. And there should be a little indicator to you that there's something deeper Jesus is getting at. When he talks about baptism, he's saying there is a baptism with which I must be baptized. There's something very deep going on here. And so I think the key is around the word anguish. Jesus is feeling anguish. What are the reasons that we feel anguish in our own lives? Hatred, right? When we don't like something or someone. If you follow the political scene that's going on right now, you probably feel some level of anguish If you're not feeling any anguish, then you're probably not following it very closely, right? There should be some level of anguish because there's so many things that seem to be problematic, right? And so you feel some anguish. Now, that anguish can be a manifestation of hatred or of fear, and they kind of go together, right? But that's not what Jesus has here. His anguish is not a hatred for the world. When he says, how I wish the world were ablaze, he's not hearkening back to a Noah moment where God washed the earth clean. That's not what's going on here. Jesus didn't come to do that. He came to do something far more difficult. Now, what is it? What are the other reasons we have anguish? So, have you ever been in a children's hospital? So in Seattle here, we have children's, but where my previous parish was, there was on occasion I would be at Mary Bridge Hospital with one of our parishioners, and on several occasions they would have a child, sometimes 2 years old, 3 years old, sometimes a little older, who had cancer. Now you go in and you see the parents and you see anguish, right? There's nothing they can do for their child medically. They can't cure their child. They're helpless. And so you see that anguish. But that anguish is because of love. The love is what is torturing them. They love their child so much. And so that anguish just impels them to express love to their child. They can't take away their suffering, but they can enter into it. And they transform it. Now, I wanted to videotape this homily here because there's a nice big cross behind me. A giant crucifix. And if you look at it long enough, you'll see anguish. You see, Jesus never forces us to change. And so if our sin, if our rejection of God is like a cancer, He's never going to take it away unless we give Him explicit permission to do so. And so there's an anguish out of love for us. He created all of us out of love. But we have that cancer, that moral cancer, the spiritual cancer. We turn away from God. He sits there in anguish. Now, in order to open our eyes to that anguish, He had to show it to us on the cross. And so there we see it. We see God's anguish for us out of love. As like a parent in the children's hospital, He waits, He shows His love, and He desires to heal. But there is that anguish that is there. In one of my weekday homilies, I have to tell you, we've had some feast days for saints that have just been phenomenal. The first part of August is incredible. There's St. Edith Stein, her religious name St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. She was a Carmelite sister who died in Auschwitz, right? We had St. John Vianney, the patron saint of diocesan priests, just a phenomenal human being, how he lived his faith. We have a saint's feast day today, and I'm going to get to him in just a minute. But one of the things I talked about in my daily Mass homilies was this. There's 3 types of people. You have people who rebel against God. And so they are just in open rebellion. They're loud and proud. They're against God, right? And so the evangelical atheists. I just made up that term. But you get the sense, these atheists are so proud of their beliefs that they go around evangelizing people. And they try to convince you and me that we're a bunch of fools for having faith, for believing in something that's otherworldly, for believing in God. The evangelical atheists, they're out there campaigning against God. And it's not just them, because they're misled, right? If you were really to get down to it, they're not trying to corrupt the world, at least in their own mind, but they've been tricked. They've been tricked by the one who wants us to turn away from God. And so our anguish there should be for them out of love, if not a little pity, but an anguish out of love. But then you also have people who are actively campaigning against God, and maybe they wouldn't think that, but by their moral decisions, by the things that they're doing in their life, they're harming so many people with their decisions. Drug use, alcohol abuse, domestic violence, even those subtle things that we don't realize that we do, the emotional abuse we can subject our family to when we're stressed out from work or we're just tired, whatever it is. The ways that we harm each other. And every single one of us can be part of that. And so that's that rebellion against God. And so you have the rebels who are fighting God. So that's on one side. Let's say that's on my left side. On my right side, though, you have a different type of rebellion. You have people who are rebelling for God. And these are the people who are just on fire, just in love with God. And they want to bring it into the world. And so these are not people who are on fire with God's love, who are just actively campaigning in judgment, especially against the people on my left, right? The rebellious against God. There's no judgment here that's being expressed per se. God will judge. God's got all the judgments in the world to go around, right? He's going to bring justice. But the anguish that those who actively rebel for God is really and truly out of love for the people who are not rebelling for God. There's an anguish there. There's a desire to cure, a desire to heal. Now, the third, many of us probably find most of our time in this area, and that's in the middle. And that's where we usually try to take the easiest path. We blow with the wind. If we're at work and people are criticizing Christianity, we tend to blow with that wind, right? Because it's the easiest path. And so we don't say anything. Perhaps we don't feel anything. Perhaps we even agree with them. But then we're at Mass, and everybody at Mass is theoretically in love with God, right? And so we blow with the wind. It's easy to be Catholic when you're at Mass, because everybody else is practicing their faith, at least in that moment, right? And so we blow with the wind. Jesus wants us, though, to be over here. He wants us to feel the anguish that He feels. He desires that the world burn with His love. He wants us to feel that too. I want to give a couple examples. This first one's kind of dumb, but I'm going to offer it anyways. So the other day we had a wedding, and in the wedding we had mariachis. So we had a band, a mariachi band, come in and play for the wedding. It's not very liturgically correct per se, but I have to say, I actually love it. Now, when they come, they're performers. They're being paid to be there, right? And so you have to make sure that they're honoring and respecting the Mass as best as possible. And they're there not to sing secular songs or anything like that. They're there to accentuate the Mass. And so they really do sing hymns and songs that are common amongst Hispanic people. Now, here's why I love the mariachis at Mass. Because they sing so powerfully. There's no sense of shame. There's no sense of embarrassment to sing. And so they come in and they just belt it out. And it's beautiful. And they blast us right out the church. Now, there's times when I'm at Mass and I say a little prayer to our Lord. And it's like, Lord, how come we don't sound that way? Right? I mean, do we have to be paid like the mariachis to sound that way? No, we don't. But how come we don't just sing, just worship with passion, with an excitement there? I've shared this with my parishes, that growing up, I'm not going to blame my brothers, right? But me and my brothers, we were like most men at Mass. We would sit towards the back, not in the very back, but towards the back. And when it came time to sing, like for example, during the Gloria, this is what we would do. We'd cross our arms and we would just stand there. And the people who are singing, and we're just standing there. And I did that for years. I would come to Mass, I would listen, participate in the verbal prayers, right? And sometimes not even that. But when it came to time to sing, I was too proud. I was embarrassed. I thought my voice wasn't very good. I never sang anywhere else, right? But it was pride. The first time that I really just had my eyes opened was the first day I went to seminary. And so I was at Mount Angel Seminary, and we were down in the crypt where we normally have our daily Mass, 200 seminarians all singing. And it's like, there's something incredibly beautiful about that. They weren't embarrassed. They weren't too proud. And so I just had a sense that the way we worship kind of says where our state of faith is. If we're willing to worship with pride about our faith, not pride in the bad sense, but just the fact that we're really in love, we burn with God's love, there's something very true about that. Now, with the mariachis, I'm kind of a stinker. So when the mariachis would show up, I would always talk to them before Mass, and I would go up to them and I would have a conversation that would really catch them off guard. Maybe it would even scare them a little bit. But I would say, are you going to communion? Because the mariachis are always Catholic, right? They're Hispanic. They're always Catholic. I said, are you going to go to communion? And obviously, in the context that they're living in the state of grace, and with Hispanics, they understand that. They understand that you do not go to communion if you have serious sin on your soul. And so I asked them the question, are you going to go to communion? And usually the answer was, he will, right? The designated communion person in the mariachis, the one guy who's actually in the state of grace. But most of the time, none of them would go to communion. Even though I would tell them that I want them to go if they're in the state of grace. And this is where it kind of breaks my heart. This is where the anguish is. Can you imagine Jesus Christ at the Last Supper, celebrating the Last Supper and telling his disciples, here's my body, here's my blood, and then some of the disciples saying, oh, sorry, Lord, can't receive communion today. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine the mariachis being there and then not receiving communion? It's almost like all the songs, everything they were doing was not real. Maybe it's kind of that blowing with the wind, right? Jesus wants us to burn with his love. He wants us to burn with his love. Jeremiah the prophet, he has that love. And he's one of the only ones. I have to say, the more we grow in holiness, many of the spiritual greats would say this, the more we grow in holiness, the more isolated we become in some ways, the more lonely we become, because we find that there really aren't always that many people who want to do that. And so Jeremiah has God's message for the people. He's a prophet. He's being sent to share it, but nobody wants to hear it. They don't like the message. And so he goes to the king and he says, King, here's the message. This is what God's saying you need to do to lead his people. King doesn't want to hear it. And so they throw him in the cistern. They throw him in prison. They threaten to kill him. And the king even bargains with him and he says, Jeremiah, can't you change the message? Can't you make it a different message? And it's like, no, I can't. It's God's message, right? We can relate to that today with some of the things going on in our world. People say, come on, Catholic Church, can't you change the message? Can't you change the teachings? And it's like, we can't change it. And so we're like Jeremiah. But that's where God wants us to be, like Jeremiah. You know, the voice crying out in the desert. He wants us to be that way. Now, my last example is one of the saints, and so it's a saint we celebrate today, Saint Maximilian Kolbe. Saint Maximilian Kolbe was a great Franciscan friar. He was already doing great things before the war. He had established Militia Immaculata. They had publications that were going out worldwide. It was really a phenomenal group that he had, friars who were there, and what they were doing in the world to bring Jesus to the world. But World War II comes crashing down, and Father Maximilian finds himself in prison, actually in Auschwitz, the same place that St. Edith Stein was killed. And so he's in Auschwitz, and there's an event that happens, and so some people escaped Auschwitz. Now, anytime somebody escaped from Auschwitz, everybody else knew the penalty, that 10 people would be selected to be executed. And so the guards begin selecting people to be executed as penalty for those who escaped. And so you can imagine yourself being a part of this group. You can imagine, you know, your head down, eyes down, you're just praying, Lord, I do not want to be one of those 10, right? I want to go home to my family. I want this war to end. As the guards go around and randomly pick people. This young dad is picked. And as they bring him up, he's pleading with the guards and he's saying, I have kids. You know, I'm a dad. And he says, you know what that's like to be a dad? I'm a dad. I need to be there for my kids. And I don't think it was necessarily that he was afraid to die, but it was simply he needed to be there for his kids. And so he's pleading with them and pleading with them. And Maximilian is there hearing this whole thing because he's there just like everybody else. And this is where he was the one who was not the one just blowing with the wind, right? He was not the coward who was actively rebelling against God, but he was going to rebel, all right. He was going to rebel for God. And so just like God's anguish on the cross for all of humanity, St. Maximilian steps out of line and comes forward. And he says, I want to take his place. Let me take his place. Now, oftentimes we put priests on a pedestal, right? And we think that their lives are somehow more important than everybody else's life. But in that moment, Father Maximilian got it. He got that. He understood the cross. He understood Jesus' anguish. And so he gave his life in exchange for one young dad, somebody he didn't even know. That's powerful, right? Now they took those 10, including Father Maximilian, they took them and they basically starved them to death. I mean, they would hasten it, but they were starving them to death. And the people who were there, they would hear him. What was he doing? He was singing hymns. He was praying. All right. Thank you very much. God bless you.